Hi, welcome everybody. My name is Renata Segura. I'm the Deputy Director for Latin America and the Caribbean at the International Crisis Group. And it is a pleasure to welcome you today to this event that we have been coordinating very generously with our colleagues at the Inter-American Dialogue called Building Peace in Colombia, 5 years after the end of the FARC conflict. Para las personas que nos están oyendo en español, o que solamente hablan español, perdón, si ven abajo hay un pequeño circulito donde pueden presionar para interpretación y ahí van a poder conectarse con nuestros traductores. We're very, very pleased to be here today in person at the dialogue, which is always exciting these days, for what is, I'm sure, going to be a fascinating conversation about where we are with the FARC 5 years after the signing of the peace agreement. So before I introduce my fellow panelists today, I am going to turn first to Michael Shifter, President here at the dialogue, for some welcoming remarks. Michael.
Thank you very much, Renata, and good afternoon to everybody. Buenas tardes, and thanks to everybody for joining us. It's really a delight for the dialogue and an honor to collaborate once again with the International Crisis Group, an organization that I respect and admire greatly. And we've partnered in the past on other issues, on Venezuela and Central America, other crises in our hemisphere, and always had very successful programs and really reports that come out from the ICG that are very serious and balanced and well documented. So for the dialogue, it's a great pleasure. And of course, this event, we're very happy to sponsor as well, a look at Colombia 5 years after the peace accords between the Colombian government and the FARC, looking particularly at the demobilization of the FARC and efforts to reintegrate ex-combatants into Colombian society, and look at what the story there has been, what's the progress that's been made, but also the important security development challenges that remain. We all know this is can be a contentious issue in Colombia, and hope that over time we'll be able to lower the temperature a little bit on this issue to be able to get some kind of common ground. We're very happy that this event coincides with the publication of an excellent report, the Fight by Other Means, Keeping the Peace with Colombia's FARC, authored here by Beth Dickinson, a senior analyst at ICG, and who will shortly share the main points, the conclusions of the report, and want to congratulate her and the ICG for this another excellent production. The dialogue itself has a very long-standing history looking at Colombia, various peace processes. Colombia has had many peace processes, as I think all of us know. Around the time of Plan Colombia, over 20 years ago, we had a task force that issued a report called Towards Greater Peace and Security in Colombia. The co-chairs then were General Brent Scowcroft and Senator Bob Graham. And the dialogue always tries to get diverse perspectives in our work, whatever country or issue that we're looking at. And we were happy that at that advisory group for that effort, we had Juan Manuel Santos and Alvaro Uribe. We know what happened to them later on, but we're happy to get them engaged. And we've had a number of events here on the peace process with the FARC, President Santos, some people who are very supportive, enthusiastic, others who are a little bit more critical and more skeptical. I want to thank our excellent speakers who will be formally introduced by Renata in a second. In addition to Beth, I want to give special thanks to Minister Palacios, who will be joining us shortly, Minister of the Interior in Colombia. We appreciate his participation, look forward to his comments. Also to Mr. Semilla, muchas gracias, señor Semilla, por acompañarnos en este evento, muy agradecido. And of course, good friend, Bernie Aronson, who will be introduced formally by Renata, but I also want to mention that he is a member of the Inter-American Dialogue. He also participated in that task force for many years, and is a very close colleague and mentor of mine. I want to really thank him for taking time out of his schedule to join us. Again, by the ICG, we're joined by Beth and Renata, who is the Deputy Director for Latin America and the Caribbean. And joining us virtually from London is Ivan Briscoe, who's the Director for Latin America and the Caribbean, also a very good friend and close partner. Before turning it over to Ivan for his opening remarks, let me just give special thanks and recognition to Gaston Ocampo, a colleague here at the Dialogue, for his invaluable support and assistance and hard work in coordinating this effort. So thanks again to everyone for joining, and really look forward to what I'm sure will be a very interesting and productive discussion. Ivan, the floor is yours.
So much, Michael. And if I may return the compliments, just to say that it's always been a real honor to be hosted by the Inter-American Dialogue in a number of events over these years, and no more so than today, with a discussion on drawing on our recent report, but with some real authorities on the subject. For those who don't know quite what we do at Crisis Group, our fundamental mission is to prevent deadly conflict, and we do this by getting very close to the conflict, by speaking to the people who are involved directly, to the decision makers, to governments, international organizations, and affected people, obviously victims of conflict primarily. And there's no doubt in our research we've done over recent years in Colombia that the challenges to peace and stability, despite the 2006 peace accord, are considerable, are substantial in areas such as the return to very large-scale growing of coca and processing of cocaine, in the killing of social leaders, which has unfortunately reached a bit of a high tide in recent years, in the growth, once again, of armed groups and the expansion of existing armed groups, the creation of new armed groups, and perhaps most visibly over the last year or so, those extremely large protests, very vocal protests, which erupted in major cities across Colombia and in rural areas, which drew very heavily on the huge economic effect and damage resulting, of course, from the pandemic. But none of this is to say that we shouldn't celebrate the 5th anniversary of that peace accord signed and sealed at the end of 2016. It has brought a number of really landmark achievements in Colombia. It has led to the disarmament and demobilization of around 14,000 former fighters and militia who belonged to the FARC. It has led in 2018 to a series of national polls, which were probably the most peaceful in recent years. And in an ironic way, it gave rise to those protests, which took place earlier this year and in 2019, by making it feasible for people to express their discontent with society and the state, but without being labeled part of a broader guerrilla movement, which is surely healthy for any democracy, particularly in Latin America. But obviously, there are dark clouds and there are uncertainties. As we look to the year ahead, we are thinking particularly of what might happen in the presidential elections in the middle of next year, around which no one would dare to speculate as who will be the winner. We are uncertain as to what will happen with the dynamics of armed groups on the ground. And of course, the major issue for Colombia as a whole remains that of recovering from the economic and health effects of the pandemic. Our recent report, which Beth, my colleague, will be describing shortly, has intended to hone in on one particularly concrete aspect of the peace accord and its implementation. The issue of what has become of those FARC fighters. How have they trodden the route to peaceful life? And what happened to those who abandoned that path and returned to warfare in rural Colombia? With the aim, obviously, of reinforcing the commitment of the FARC, the ex-FARC, to the peace process, and giving ideas to the government as to how it can increase and intensify its support for the peace process so that it moves forward beyond these 5 years and fulfills all the promises which were drawn up so many years ago. That was the intention of our report. We very much hope the discussion today will move in that direction. We're very grateful to be joined by such authorities formerly from the US government, from the current Colombian government, Minister Palacios, from the FARC itself, and of course from our own experts. Once again, thank you for the dialogue and for enabling this to take place. And on that note, I hand over to Renata, who will introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ivan. So just brief introductions of my fellow panelists before we get going with the substance of the conversation. So I'll introduce all of them briefly in order of which they will speak. So to my right, first, it's Elizabeth Dickinson, best known as Beth. Beth has been the senior analyst for Colombia since 2019, and she has done a lot of work on conflict dynamics, illicit crops, social leaders, and really traveled the country, across the country, spoke to over 200 people to produce this recent report on the FARC that we will be discussing today. Beth used to be our senior analyst at the Arabian Peninsula, but we're very happy that she came to the Latin America team. Then we will have Minister Daniel Palacios, who is Colombia's Minister of Interior. He used to serve as the Vice Minister of Political Relations and Private Secretary for former President Uribe. He is, in addition, a lieutenant of the National Army Reserve. We will then turn to Mr. Ricardo Semilla, who is a former FARC member, and he is the elected leader of the Charras ETCR, which are the territorial spaces for capacitation and reincorporation, which have anchored the FARC's post-conflict spaces. And then finally, we'll have Bernard Aronson. Mr. Aronson is the former U.S. Special Envoy to the Colombian peace process, and he is a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs. He received the State Department's Distinguished Service Award for ending wars in Central America and Colombia. Thank you, everybody, very, very much for being with us today. So what we'll do is that we'll do brief presentations. Each of my panelists will have around 8 to 10 minutes to present. I will let them know if they're going over time. And then hopefully we will be able to do a conversation with your questions and answers. For those of you who are online, if you see under the screen, you will see a Q&A little box where you can type your questions. We will definitely be mindful of time, so we have time to engage with your questions. Please feel free to start writing them in there as the event goes on and things pop into your mind. And we'll hopefully have a good time for chatting after that. So with no further ado, Beth.
Thank you so much. And it's such a pleasure to be here with all of you today. What I want to basically do is walk through a little bit of what we found in our report, which we spent over 9 months working on 10 departments of Colombia. And I want to really highlight here that we had the opportunity, for which I'm quite grateful, to speak not only with members of the former FARC, ex-combatants, local authorities, national authorities, also members of the military, really got sort of a panoramic view of the situation on the ground. Before I begin, I think I want to explain a little bit about why we looked at this topic now on the 5-year anniversary of the agreement. You know, what has become of this guerrilla movement that sought to transition finally into democratic politics is a question that matters not only for the success of this process and the success of the thousands of members who have been committed to peace since 2016, but also for the ability of for us to safeguard the negotiated solution to Colombia's persistent conflicts that continue to afflict parts of its territory. So thinking about whether this process has worked and what messages it sends to other existing armed groups and conflicts, not just in Colombia, frankly, but broader in the region, I think it really has an importance that even transcends this particular process itself. How can we safeguard the negotiated solution to conflict and make sure that there is an exit ramp to the persistent violence that afflicts the countryside? Let me say first what has worked dramatically in this peace process, which is the disarmament of the FARC. And I saw this, traveling from department to department in Colombia. The level of commitment among ex-combatants is really remarkable. They have remained committed despite enormous economic challenges, despite almost 300 ex-combatants being killed, despite enormous threats to their own personal security, stigmatization within society. And you hear it in their voices, but even more, I think you see it in the way that they have persisted through these difficulties and stuck with the process. I think in many ways, the decision by the US government, which we welcomed, to delist the former FARC from its list of foreign terrorist organizations, is a recognition and a very important symbolic and political decision to really give credit to this movement that did lay down arms as promised and whose members have very much complied with that process. I think that is a success. It's a success of the FARC. It's a success of the international community who has been guaranteeing and monitoring this process. It's a success of the government. And I think really one of the things that we look at in this report is how do we now ensure that it becomes a sustainable transition into economic life, into social life, and into political life. I think this is an area now where we have more concerns about the sort of reincorporation process, the ability of former combatants to build their lives, to engage back in the societies in which they are reincorporating. The first, I think, set of concerns relates to their economic security. Although more than half of ex-combatants now technically have a new livelihood project, I think when we look at what that looks like on the ground, very few of these projects are actually generating income. Very few of these projects are necessarily, I think, in a way that we can expect them to survive for 5, 10, 15 years. Part of that is the difficulty of the circumstances. Part of that is, I think, a lack of economic options in the countryside. And one of the things that we very much hope the US decision to delist the former FARC will do is facilitate a stronger emphasis on the economic aspect of reintegration by opening up access to the financial system, removing some of the stigmatization that employers and companies had with working with ex-combatants. I want to give a particularly concrete example of the economic challenges when it relates to women within the process. So women within the FARC were not allowed to have children within the ranks of the guerrilla movement. So when many of them demobilized, it was an opportunity for them to finally restart or to start families or to reclaim children who they had to leave with family members while they were fighting. Essentially, however, what this has done with the process, first of all, I think reintegration officials and international officials, first of all, noticed that one of the best guarantees against backsliding in the process was for ex-combatants to have families, to have some sort of stability. Unfortunately, that pushed a lot of the burden of making sure the process was sustainable onto the shoulders of women and sort of shunted them back into traditional gender roles for which they were not necessarily accustomed to living, having been part of a military movement for a very long time. So reports of domestic violence have risen dramatically. The sort of base income that the government provides to all ex-combatants for women has had to cover not only their expenses, but those of their children. A lack of childcare in demobilization zones has made it more difficult for them to restart their lives. I think, the context in which they're operating is really, in many cases, quite dramatic. I think the second major sort of sustainability challenge that we see to reintegration is the security threat that many ex-combatants are facing. And here, of course, we have the dramatic number of almost 300 assassinations. But beyond those cases, which are really almost sort of just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the violence that ex-combatants are experiencing, because they're the ones who have reached sort of the absolute conclusion. Behind all of that are hundreds and hundreds more ex-combatants who have been threatened, stigmatized, forcibly displaced from rural areas to safeguard their security. I think for us, this is really a concern, not only again for their own personal safety, but for the message it sends to potential future armed movements who might seek to negotiate or disarm about the ability to guarantee their basic security. I think the other aspect of reintegration that we find so vital in understanding in this process is the political reintegration. What the FARC wanted when they entered this process was the chance finally to have a seat at the table in elected politics and in sort of determining the future of the country. No one was guaranteeing them to be an electoral success, but what the peace accord did promise was an even playing field in which they could compete. And I think, unfortunately, we haven't reached that stage yet, in part because of the security concerns, in part because of a lack of guarantees from one of the points of the agreement related to political reform. But we saw this very clearly, for example, in the national strikes place in May and June. Many ex-combatants who felt very compelled by the social justice aspect of the protests on the street didn't feel they had the guarantees to participate because of threats to their security. So I think our argument here is that, again, we need to work harder to make sure that civic participation is an option for ex-combatants, that they can effectively reintegrate into their communities as members of social organizations, elected office, or however they might choose. I think a final point that I will just draw attention to was this matter of what happened to the very few number of ex-combatants who did return to arms and have since started the seeds of what has now grown into the FARC dissident movements. I think the key here is really to understand these dissident movements as a distinct phenomenon from the past that are dominated by new recruits. Despite the sort of old faces from the past, the vast majority of these groups are economically focused, lacking and immature in ideology, and driven by a local and distinct territorial logic that doesn't correspond with the past conflict. I think, one of the main points that we would also draw out in the report is that these groups have really come to fruition and been able to expand because they're preying on the same inequalities and lack of opportunities that the peace accord itself is meant to address. So despite the fact that we are now entering a new cycle of a reconfigured conflict, the peace accord continues to offer a pathway forward and a set of reforms that are vital to rolling back that next cycle of violence in the countryside. Let me stop there.
Thank you so much, Beth. That was great. We're going to do a little change in the schedule order of the event. So, Mr. Semilla, if we can ask you to go next, ¿está bien? Si usted nos conversa ahora, por favor, si nos da su participación, unos 8 minuticos, por favor, le aviso si se está alargando, ¿vale?
Bueno, muy buenas tardes para todas y para todos. Estaba aquí atento tomando nota. Precisamente, nosotros hemos experimentado algo muy interesante. Creo que ya lo planteaban. Realmente Ricardo Semillas es mi nombre en la insurgencia. Y por cosas de la vida, al llegar nosotros aquí al proceso, no era muy fácil que entre nosotros incluso nos identificáramos con los nombres. Parte de la existencia y de la vida clandestina en la resistencia armada era, al llegar allá, iniciar una nueva vida, y esa nueva vida comenzaba incluso desde tener un nuevo nombre, tener una nueva identidad, y a partir de ahí conocernos entre todos con esa identidad. En realidad mi nombre es Francisco Gamboa Hurtado. Yo lidero la comunidad noble de paz Marco Aurelio Buendía, o lo que se conoció en su momento el ETCR de Charras, y soy el consejero político del Partido Comunes en el departamento del Guaviare. También lidero algunos procesos afrodescendientes aquí en el departamento, y pues he tenido que desde la experiencia propia mirar cómo el proceso de paz ha avanzado de alguna manera, pero también todas las limitaciones y todas los problemas que existen en cuanto a la implementación misma del acuerdo. Nosotros siempre hemos dicho de que se han hecho muchas cosas en cuanto a lo que tiene que ver con la implementación del acuerdo. Se ha hecho mucho en lo que tiene que ver sobre reincorporación económica, social y política, pero el acuerdo no es eso. El acuerdo va mucho más allá. El acuerdo solo podríamos decir que en un 90% habla de el país como tal, y solo en un 10% habla sobre qué va a pasar con quienes estamos en proceso de reincorporación o quienes decidimos en su momento hacer dejación de armas y venir a ser parte, incluso lo decimos nosotros de esa manera, ser parte de estas reglas del juego, incluso cuando nosotros no las compartíamos desde nuestro propio ejercicio, y precisamente pues por eso estaba las FARC como un ejército levantado en armas. Había un levantamiento armado precisamente porque no estábamos de acuerdo con el status quo y con el estado de cosas que estaban sucediendo. Pero luego al llegar aquí al acuerdo de paz y se hace todo el proceso de la firma como tal y la llegada a los espacios que han sido, yo siempre lo he planteado así, yo creo que a hoy, a 5 años, ha tenido 3 momentos muy importantes el acuerdo de paz. Uno es la firma del acuerdo como tal en 2016, que es donde definitivamente las FARC decide como organización dejar las armas para debatir sus ideas a nivel político. Eso implica pues obviamente un reto muy grande, un reto que nosotros estudiamos mucho en los campamentos. Yo recuerdo que eran horas y eran días enteros estudiando el acuerdo, cómo estaba quedando, qué era lo que se estaba acordando y qué no se estaba acordando. Y era fue un momento de mucha dedicación, incluso desde todos nosotros al interior, incluso en la selva. Recuerdo que se llamaban gemas, lo que nos llegaba a nosotros, hablándonos precisamente como los comunicados que llegaban de los acuerdos a los que se estaban llegando y en cuales no se habían podido llegar a ningún tipo de acuerdos. Y también nosotros opinábamos y empezábamos a generar debate frente a eso. Yo creo que ese fue un primer momento muy interesante. Luego viene un segundo momento, y de la firma pues hablo incluso de un momento que llega hasta la dejación efectiva de las armas, cuando cada uno de nosotros firma un acta donde se compromete a no volver a utilizar las armas como ejercicio político, sino que además dijimos desde hoy avanzaremos hacia la discusión de una sociedad mejor, pero en el marco de la democracia y en el marco de la lucha política, y desde ahí dijimos por eso que nuestra única arma sería la palabra, y al día de hoy hemos mantenido nuestra palabra. Sabemos que han habido dificultades en el marco de la implementación del acuerdo, incluso quienes han decidido abandonar el acuerdo, pero pues creemos nosotros que eso es una decisión de manera individual, que no implica al colectivo de miembros de la guerrilla de las FARC que decidimos hacer dejación de armas, porque aún nos mantenemos en su gran mayoría firmes en nuestra palabra y comprometidos, aún empeñados en cumplir esa palabra de mantenernos en el acuerdo de paz y de cumplirlo, y demandamos incluso del Estado colombiano de que tome esa misma decisión, porque sí creemos de alguna manera de que esa decisión aún no se ha tomado de manera consecuente. Entonces, ese primer momento, pues nosotros lo hemos leído muy rápidamente así. Hay un segundo momento, y es cuando se hace precisamente ya la dejación de armas y los miembros de la guerrilla de las FARC empiezan todo su proceso de reincorporación. Yo creo que ese segundo momento es un cambio en el modo incluso de cómo vivíamos nosotros, de una guerrilla que era totalmente móvil, unas personas que estaban acostumbrados a anochecer en un sitio y amanecer en otro, pero ya llegar a una vida sedentaria donde íbamos a estar quietos, empeñados en no solo prepararnos para el cumplimiento de ese acuerdo, sino prepararnos para llegar a ser parte de esa sociedad. Si lo decimos de alguna manera, yo, perdón, soy de la idea que nosotros siempre estuvimos en la sociedad, nosotros siempre convivimos con los campesinos, siempre estuvimos ahí entre ellos, además, porque nosotros pues somos carne de su carne, decimos nosotros. Y también ese proceso de reincorporación no solo lo necesitábamos, no solo lo iniciamos nosotros como miembros de la guerrilla de las FARC, sino que también era como el Estado empezaba a llegar a estos territorios donde en algún momento la guerrilla fue una autoridad y empezaba a aparecer como Estado, a presentarse como Estado y a llevar la inversión social a estos territorios, cosa que aún nos ha parecido que ha estado muy floja y no ha llegado como debe haber llegado, como se lo propuso el acuerdo y como lo planteó. Pues también estos campesinos de estos territorios iban a entrar a un proceso de reincorporación, porque de alguna manera muchos de ellos pues vivían también de una economía que no era legal, y el acuerdo pues planteaba una solución precisamente a ese fenómeno. Y en ese momento pues nosotros llegamos a esos territorios y al llegar a estos territorios la gente pues nos abren las puertas, que es algo que hay que decirlo. En el caso de los lugares donde llegamos nosotros, pues la gente nos recibió muy bien. La decisión que tomamos fue muy bien vista. También sabemos que hubo sectores y hay sectores que no compartieron la decisión, pero también otros desde puntos de vista. Y luego viene un tercer momento y es cuando empieza todo, empieza a surgir lo que nosotros teníamos. Muchos de nosotros, cuando estábamos hablando de la firma del acuerdo, nos preguntamos ¿qué vamos a hacer con la experiencia que tenemos de la firma de otros acuerdos de paz con otras organizaciones guerrilleras, donde prácticamente el Estado colombiano traicionó a estas organizaciones? ¿Qué va a pasar cuando nos empiecen a matar la gente? Esas preguntas nos las hicimos nosotros. Y a hoy contamos 300 compañeros y compañeras asesinados. Y eso para nosotros es triste, porque quizás ni en los peores momentos de la guerra eso nos llegó a pasar. Eso nos llegó a pasar. A veces nos sentamos con compañeros y decimos, hombre, pero es que hay años donde nos han matado más gente en la paz que en la misma guerra. Y eso obviamente ha generado muchas preocupaciones en nosotros. Hemos insistido no solo en pedirle al Estado colombiano, en pedirle a la comunidad internacional que miren este acuerdo de paz, que miren lo que está pasando con los firmantes del acuerdo, la situación en la que estamos nosotros, que hemos tenido que incluso llegar a estrados judiciales con el Estado colombiano para poder incluso solicitar seguridad para liderazgos nuestros en los territorios. El conflicto en Colombia, gracias incluso a ese incumplimiento del acuerdo de paz, se ha venido recrudeciendo. Organizaciones que habían quedado en la firma del acuerdo sin un instrumento político para continuar una lucha armada, pues lo han vuelto a retomar porque no cumplir el acuerdo de alguna manera les dio la razón de lo que ellos en su momento alegaron. Entonces, pues obviamente son preocupaciones que surgen y que es en la que estamos en este momento. En este momento hay mucha incertidumbre. Lo que nos está pasando en el Yarí, por ejemplo, es una cosa supremamente grave. Tenemos todo un espacio territorial en un riesgo muy alto. Incluso es inevitable el desplazamiento de esos compañeros de ese espacio territorial. Y si no le ponemos el cuidado, la atención que necesita esto, el futuro o lo que pasó con los compañeros del Yarí va a ser el futuro del resto de espacios territoriales. Recordemos que este no es el primero que le sucede eso, que se tiene que desplazar de su territorio, incluso por el mismo recrudecimiento de la violencia en estos territorios. Entonces, es muy preocupante esto. Nosotros que lideramos espacios, yo tengo bajo mi responsabilidad la dirección de una comunidad junto con un grupo de compañeros, líderes también, 147 firmantes del acuerdo de paz. Y esos 147 firmantes todos los días nos están preguntando a nosotros qué pasa con nuestra seguridad, qué va a pasar con nosotros, si esto no termina cumpliéndose, qué va a pasar con nuestros hijos, porque ahora tenemos familia. primero éramos nosotros, ¿sí? Y estábamos solos, estábamos en la selva y estábamos allá sin nada que nos atara de alguna manera, pero hoy en día tenemos hijos, tenemos hijas y es necesario que el Estado colombiano entienda de que ha venido surgiendo un nuevo colectivo de víctimas en este país y son las mujeres, las madres, los padres, hermanos y familiares, hijos y familiares de estos firmantes que han sido asesinados.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Semilla. Very, very thoughtful contribution. I'm going to turn now to Mr. Aronson, who was very, very involved and very close to the whole process. Mr. Aronson, thank you.
Thank you. First of all, I just want to say that this is a terrific report that was produced by the International Crisis Group, I guess in conjunction with the dialogue, but it really gets to the roots of the story, not just what's happening, but an explanation of all the dynamics, political and personal and historic. I really give a lot of credit to the people who did this work and spent so much time. And I think the report is very, very valuable. So congratulations. You know, in evaluating the peace agreement, I think we need to remind ourselves what it set out to do. Clearly, the first and principal goal was to end the war. And on that score, as the report has said, as many people have said, implementation has been quite successful. The FARC, as they promised to do, turned in their weapons. I was at one of the early events where they did turn in the weapons, and the UN was blowtorching them. And I was very pleased to see that the weapons were in very good shape, because if you think about going back to war, maybe sometime, and hedging your bets, then you hand in the weapons that are the least functional and the least, valuable. But the FARC handed in very good weapons, which is a good sign of their commitment not to go back to war. So the disarmament, demobilization, reintegration, particularly the disarmament, ending the longest war in the Western Hemisphere, was an enormous success. And when you think of the dimensions of the war and the price of the war, 260,000 Colombians killed, 20,000 kidnapped for ransom, more than 9 million registered as victims, 80,000 disappeared. This was an ongoing catastrophe for this country for 52 years. So ending it was no small feat. But as President Santos said often, making peace is harder than making war. And I think this report has well documented many of the places where the state has failed to meet its obligations or has provided inadequate resources, inadequate commitment. One strategic and far-reaching mistake was that what everybody involved in the peace process said from the beginning and knew was that once the FARC withdrew from the territories that it has historically been controlling, the state had to move in quickly with all the things that were missing: services and justice and security and economic development. But instead, the state, neither in the outgoing administration, but primarily in the new administration, it really failed to fill this vacuum. And so it was inevitable that they would be filled by former paramilitaries, drug traffickers, these dissident groups, which you've rightly pointed out, are not largely former FARC combatants. And so, President Santos had a vision for the agreement that said the goal was not just to end the war, but to bring the two Colombias together. The Colombia of the Campo, where the government doesn't exist, where there's hardly any services, the government of the cities, and make it into one Colombia. So that second part of the vision, the related part, has been very tortured and bureaucratic and inadequate. And I think that the Duque government made the peace agreement a significant part of the presidential campaign that they won. But I think once that was over, they should have made it clear that the Colombian state embraces the agreement, accepts the agreement, is wholeheartedly going to try to enforce the agreement. And that signal, I think, has always been hedged a little bit. And I worry that the peace agreement will become a political football again in the upcoming presidential elections. That's not what it needs. It needs a unified Colombia trying to make the provisions happen. You know, one thing I'll end on one point, which is that this peace agreement has a legacy that I think will inform future peace agreements around the world. I think it'll be very hard to negotiate a peace agreement like we did in El Salvador, which provides an amnesty to all the actors. That used to be the norm. And obviously the creation of the International Criminal Court makes that harder, but I think this agreement will establish a baseline that others will not be allowed to slide back under. And I think this agreement, by putting victims first and really going after the root causes of the war and trying to develop legitimate programs to address those, I think that will also become a baseline demand. I don't think another peace negotiation will be allowed to exclude victims from the table. And I think that's extremely important. You know, the implementation period is supposed to be 15 years. So there's time to improve, there's time to change. At the end of the day, it requires political will from the political and economic leadership of Colombia. That's the key ingredient. The rest of it is not simple or easy, but it can be done so long as there's a unified political will inside Colombia to do so. And I hope that that will is manifest, because if it is not, the framework of the agreement, which I think gives a framework for the state to modernize and deal with many of these historic problems of land and poverty and economic marginalization. If the peace agreement is not there as a template, then I worry about, you know, division and disintegration. And we're already seeing that on the security front. So, you know, it was a great thing to end this war. And it's been pointed out, this was the fourth attempt. If this had failed, there wouldn't have been another for many years in Colombia. So I think we should give great credit to President Santos and his administration, and to the leaders of the FARC who made a decision to end the war on reasonable terms.
Thank you so much. We're waiting for Minister Palacios to join us. I wonder if he's here now.
Buenas tardes, les habla Marcela Mosquera, yo soy la jefe de gabinete del ministro Daniel Palacios. Él ha estado muy pendiente, estaba en unas reuniones para poder, digamos, pasar a compartir con ustedes este panel. Desafortunadamente estamos en cierres de legislatura en este momento y tuvo un llamado de urgencia al Congreso de la República para unas votaciones. Él lamenta excusarse, realmente es un tema para nosotros fundamental y para él de la mayor importancia en su agenda. De antemano pido mil disculpas, pero no podrá acompañarnos en esta ocasión a pesar de la voluntad y el interés que él tenía por participar. Muchas gracias y espero poder acudirlo para acompañarlo en unas próximas ocasiones.
Okay, muchas gracias. Bueno, we're very sorry that we won't be able to have anybody from the Colombian government. We really were hoping to get, obviously their participation would have been very, very interesting to hear on this topic, but we have a great panel and I'm sure there's plenty to have a conversation about. So this will just give us a little bit more time for the Q&A. So losses and gains, I guess. So if it's okay, maybe I'm gonna turn to Beth for one question, one each for each of the panelists before we open the Q&A that we're getting from the audience. Beth, I think, and maybe Mr. Semilla will have something to say about this too. The report sort of looks in quite a bit of detail about the political part of the reincorporation and sort of a little bit of the crisis that Comunes, the political party that was created after the FARC demobilized, how it's looking politically. What do you think? There's something interesting that Mr. Aronson said, that the goal of the peace agreement was to end the war, which is certainly the case. But in the report, we go into some detail about what was the goal for the FARC beyond the ending of the war. Could you talk a little bit about what that imagined goal was and how it's looking right now?
Absolutely. So I think this is such an important thing to understand in terms of our evaluation of where the process is for all sides and whether it's achieved sort of its goal objectives and what message it sends again to future negotiations. So, as you mentioned, Renata, and I think Ricardo, you also said it quite well, the FARC really envisioned that they were not demobilizing. They were laying down their arms and moving their fight for what they believed was the right path of social justice to democratic politics. So it was a fight by other means. And this is exactly where the title of our report comes from, is this idea that you can be tolerated that there is an opening and an ability for an armed movement to transition and play by the rules of the game. I think, what the FARC imagined, and in the words of one senior official, I thought that this was so powerful. She told me, for the FARC, the most important institution that emerged from the accord was the formation of our political party. The ability to have that entity through which to play a role. For anyone who knows Colombian politics today, it won't be a surprise to hear that, unfortunately, the successor political party, which is today called Comunes, has not been as influential or had as strong of a voice in the national debate as was imagined. I think our explanation for this has several components, and I'll mention them just very briefly. I think the first one really relates to something that Bernie, you mentioned quite eloquently, which is this idea of bringing two Colombias together, the sort of urban sphere and the rural sphere, and this vast inequality that existed between them. The FARC really imagined their role as being the shepherds of bringing rural Colombia, sort of improving those inequalities. They believed that by the very nature of their reincorporation, which was in rural areas and areas that had very little state presence, their reincorporation there would sort of force the state to show up. It would force the institutions to finally set up there. And then in doing so, they would be able to not only shape the way that the state was developing its capacity, but also build a trust with the communities around sort of a new economic model that was intended to, again, level the playing field. I think it was a great surprise, first of all, to the FARC itself, that their influence in the countryside was not as easily transitioned from arms into civilian life. That this was not a fluidless, seamless transition. I think as one official put it to me, it's one thing, leadership in arms is one thing, but it's very different to lead a community with just your rhetoric and your voice. And I think this was a lesson that I think became a surprise for many who had to sort of really start from scratch in terms of rebuilding the trust with the community. But the context also didn't help. First of all, because of the rising levels of insecurity. It was very hard for ex-combatants to continue to establish and build trust with communities when there was a new armed group who was in the area and who was sort of setting the rules. And not only that, who was targeting ex-combatants. Certainly a community wouldn't want to approach ex-combatants if they themselves are being put at risk by doing so. But I think that the other sort of deeper fundamental issue at play here was that the slow, in some cases, frankly, lackluster implementation of parts of the accord, the FARC really paid the political price for that in the countryside. And here's a concrete example is the coca substitution program, where ex-combatants of the FARC were very involved in the process initially. They went house to house and convinced coca farmers, you can rip up your crops. The government really will help you provide, help provide you with a new livelihood. They will help you transition. And it was the FARC that convinced many people to come on board. So when this program was not followed through with, according to timelines and expectations, the campesinos, the farmers came back to the FARC and said, it's your fault. You're the ones who convinced us to join this process. We never believed the government, but you brought us on board. I think that lack of rural implementation of the key, what Ricardo called sort of the heart of the process, this rural reform, first of all, undermined sort of the FARC's credibility in their ability to advocate for communities. And second of all, just perpetuated the same context that they had been fighting to change. That's reflected today, I think, in the split within the national level political party, because there's really no consensus about how to rebuild those roots in rural areas. And today it very much feels like the political party doesn't have a foot on the ground in the territories. And I think the last point that I'll make on this is like there is a risk not only for that political party itself, frankly, whose success we can't vote, we can't cheer on, nor can we sort of hope that we should neither hope that it succeeds nor fails. That's for Colombian voters to decide. What we hope is that they have a level playing ground to play on. The risk for the peace process, however, is that a divided FARC makes it much harder for them to play a strong role as a counterpart to the government in advocating for that persistent implementation. If we don't know who represents the ex-combatants, if we can't have coherence around their priorities, it makes it much harder for the international community, for the government, sort of frankly for all of us to interact with that process and make sure that it has two strong parties within it.
Great, thank you so much. Señor Semilla, y quizás usted quiera comentarnos un poco sobre ese mismo tema, cómo usted ve a las FARC en el liderazgo tanto nacional a través de comunes, pero también en las comunidades como en la que usted está, cómo ha sido la relación, crear de nuevo esa relación con las comunidades ahora desde desde la vida civil, sin las armas. ¿Cómo ve usted el futuro de comunes tanto en la política nacional, pero también local?
Mónica del Ministerio del Interior. ¿Cómo estás? ¿Cómo te ha ido? Mónica Gómez, ¿cómo te ha ido? ¿Por qué me estás timbrando, Mónica?
Ricardo, ¿me escuchó la pregunta?
Sí, era la palabra muy
¿Bloquear?
Muted.
Tal vez no. Ricardo,
He's muted.
¿me está escuchando la pregunta que le hice? Maybe we go to a question for Mr. Aronson before we turn back to Mr. Semilla.
Sí, efectivamente, qué pena, no le escuché. ¿Me puede repetirme, por favor?
Sí, cómo no. Estábamos hablando un poco sobre cómo está Comunes hoy en día, cómo lo ve usted como partido político a nivel nacional, pero también a nivel local, y cómo ve usted el proceso de construcción de relación con las comunidades desde el ETCR, desde los espacios más locales. ¿Cómo ha sido ese proceso para ustedes?
Yo no estoy oyendo por si están hablando.
Okay. Le voy a mandar un WhatsApp, okay? Bernie, maybe we turn to you, Mr. Aronson, for now. Because naturally you were speaking pretty clearly about the importance that the peace process had for Colombia overall, and that's something that has regional implications. the US was such a key partner for the process during the negotiations. And it has been, I think, throughout the last 4 years, a voice that keeps encouraging the implementation regardless of the problems that there has been. What do you envision both the US but also the international community's role looking forward? Like, what do you think are the main challenges? What are the main goals that the international community should be pushing these and outgoing government, but also the next president to really engage with in terms of the peace process?
You're asking me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I think the donor community, which has been pretty generous in supporting the peace agreement, including the United States and particularly the United States, I think they need to use their assistance as leverage to press for a much more efficient and committed implementation process. Bureaucracies are slow and complicated, and not every failure is deliberate. But if you read your own report, even in areas where some progress has been made, the percentage of the task or the percentage of the resources that have been budgeted are woefully inadequate for what the commitment is. And so I think that the donor community has the most clout. The UN also has a role, which I hope it will continue to play in monitoring compliance. I think we need to keep NGOs and others, human rights groups and others, ICG, the dialogue, need to keep focusing publicly on the violence that's being visited on social leaders and indigenous leaders and the like, so that is, a pressure on the government to do more than it's done and be more efficient. And finally, just, I think the countries that have been involved with Colombia on this journey need to signal with this new administration in Washington that this is a political priority for them, and continue the close cooperation between the EU and the United States that existed during the peace process. Because it was very, that EU had their own representative with whom I dealt a lot. And it was a good relationship. I think we saw eye to eye on most items. But, it's very hard to sustain international interest on any issue. People move on to the next crisis of the day. But for all the reasons you said in that report, this is an historic agreement. If we can make it work, it's a model for other people to follow, and particularly in areas of justice. I didn't mention that as sort of the part of the legacy. But the opposite of what the critics say about the transitional justice is the case, which is there is no other peace agreement in which so many of the actors, all of the actors, not just the guerrillas, but the state actors and private actors, all have to come before a judicial system and account for their crimes and be held accountable for some sort of punishment. The attacks on the agreement would have you believe everybody's amnesty. Just the opposite is true. All the top leaders have to go through this process, and they could be sentenced up to 8 years in various forms of, restorative justice, like clearing landmines and that sort of thing. So, but anyway, the donor community, EU, the US, has to signal, one, this is a priority for our own foreign policy. We want to see it go forward. It's important for regional stability. And we want to see the terms, carried out with good faith and a real commitment.
Thank you so much. I don't know, Ricardo, ¿nos está escuchando ahora otra vez? No? Okay, I think we might be having troubles with Ricardo. So maybe what I'll do is that I'll turn out for now to some of the questions that we have in the Q&A, unless Ricardo's back. Ricardo, ¿me escucha? Sí, ok. ¿Quiere comentarnos entonces la pregunta que le estábamos haciendo sobre comunes?
Bien, es que tengo problemas para escuchar el audio, pero sí ya copié las preguntas. Ese proceso de construir relaciones con las comunidades, como decía al inicio, para nosotros no fue muy complejo, precisamente porque nosotros vivíamos aquí, en estos territorios. Eran nuestras áreas donde mantenían nuestras unidades, nuestras estructuras, nuestros frentes. Pero sí creo que Elizabeth decía algo que es muy cierto, y es que pasar de tener el control territorial como organización armada a poder influenciar esto ya desde el nivel político, pues implicó incluso un esfuerzo mucho más grande. Y yo creo que fue un ejercicio también muy humano como de rasgar esas vestiduras militares, ¿no? Y poder llegarle a la gente con ese espíritu no solo solidario, sino que también de compromiso de mantenernos en el acuerdo. En el caso nuestro, las relaciones han sido muy buenas con las comunidades. Fue muy complejo al principio que la gente entendiera que nosotros ya no éramos una guerrilla, que ya no éramos la autoridad en ese territorio, y entonces la gente generalmente estaba buscándonos para contarnos el problema de la finca, el problema con el vecino, el problema con no sé qué. Entonces fue un poquito complejo hacer que la gente lo entendiera, y debo decirlo que aún no todo el mundo lo ha entendido, porque aún hay gente que lo busca a uno para ese tipo de cosas. Pero yo creo que sí hemos avanzado significativamente. Entonces ya desde el momento de decir a la gente, mire, esto ya cambió, nosotros no somos quienes ejercemos el control de este territorio, no somos una autoridad ya, y nosotros estamos, al igual que ustedes, en un proceso de acostumbrarnos también a la institucionalidad, cómo funcionan, lo que decía al principio de las reglas del juego. Y pues la gente también fue caminando con nosotros. Hay algo que yo lo digo desde una experiencia muy personal. Al inicio sí se influenció de alguna manera en estas regiones, pues porque aún se mantenía la gente aún creía en que como eran los guerrilleros y ahora son los exguerrilleros, pero era muy difícil diferenciar los dos momentos. La gente era muy difícil diferenciarlo, y entonces aún en su cabeza tenían que nosotros éramos guerrilleros, ¿sí? Éramos la autoridad en esa región. Mi propuesta al inicio, incluso desde la comunidad que yo dirijo, fue: nosotros tenemos que apartarnos de esa orientación con la comunidad, mientras la gente entiende que nosotros ya no somos quien impone ese tipo de orientaciones, sino que ahora es a ellos a quien les tocó tomar las riendas de sus comunidades, en esto de los liderazgos propios, desde las juntas de acción comunal o desde los corregimientos, que eso pues ha sido realmente un ejercicio muy interesante en el relacionamiento con la gente. Después de un año, eso fue un ejercicio que hicimos nosotros muy interesante en mi comunidad, dijimos es un año. Después de un año, incluso cuando nos insistían muchas veces en que los acompañáramos en reuniones de juntas de acción comunal, nosotros no asistíamos, porque queríamos precisamente llegar a ese ejercicio y saber si era una de las formas como la gente entendía precisamente que nosotros no podíamos seguir incidiendo, además porque para nosotros no era bueno que eso siguiera pasando. Y ahora tenemos una situación muy interesante, y es que desde hace año y medio nosotros venimos acompañando muchos procesos de juntas de acción comunal. Hoy incluso estábamos reunidos con unos compañeros que fueron electos ahorita a juntas de acción comunal, a directivas de juntas de acción comunal. En el caso nuestro, tenemos 5 compañeros y 2 compañeras que fueron elegidos a directivas de juntas de acción comunal. Y ese ha sido, es decir, yo creo que partiendo de ahí es la muestra de cómo nosotros hemos llegado a acertar en ese planteamiento. No ha pasado en todo lado, ¿cierto? No ha pasado en todo lado, y eso lo que ha generado han sido incluso dificultades. Nosotros creemos que el proceso de reincorporación tiene que ir más allá de que lleguen los firmantes del acuerdo de paz y se queden como un grupito aparte de una vereda, de una comunidad, sino que tienen que de entrar a la comunidad, ser parte de ella, porque el proceso de reincorporación comunitario es que uno, yo lo digo así en esas palabras, que alguien se pare en una comunidad y no sepa quién es reincorporado y quién no. Es allá donde tenemos que llegar porque la gente se tiene que fundir con la comunidad para convertirse en ella, ser parte de ella y ayudarla a salir adelante. Y eso hay que hacerlo con mucha modestia, con mucho compromiso, con mucho esfuerzo colectivo, incluso como lo hacemos nosotros. Yo creo que parte de lo que nosotros hemos podido aportar, y yo siempre digo a los compañeros, uno no aporta diciéndole a la gente qué hay que hacer, sino mostrando que uno lo puede hacer, que así como lo hacemos nosotros, también lo pueden hacer ellos, mostrando que desde el espíritu colectivo también se puede avanzar y se puede avanzar mucho más rápido que desde lo individual. Yo creo que eso ha sido una lectura que en las comunidades ha quedado de alguna manera muy clara y ahora está esa tendencia, incluso donde estamos nosotros ubicados, la gente a unirse en colectivos para poder avanzar mucho más incluso en la construcción de su propio futuro y en la construcción de una economía solidaria que vaya mucho más allá de la competitiva en la que nos han acostumbrado. Entonces, en ese razonamiento con la comunidad ha sido muy interesante. Hay algo también muy importante a tener en cuenta. Y más, y uno esta pregunta con la otra, frente al liderazgo del Partido Comunes. Yo creo que también nosotros no leímos muy bien en su momento al pueblo colombiano. No leímos al colombiano de a pie, como decimos nosotros. Pero tampoco leímos no solo al colombiano de a pie, sino que no leímos también a sectores que influencian mucho en muchos sectores de la sociedad. Y como no lo leímos bien, nosotros creímos que al llegar a este acuerdo, lo que iba a pasar era que todo el mundo no solo lo iba a apoyar, yo creo que desde el plebiscito eso fue quedando claro, sino que es que iba a haber de alguna manera una polarización en el país frente a lo que fue el acuerdo de paz o lo que es el acuerdo de paz. Eso ha venido cambiando, la balanza se ha ido inclinando mucho más en quienes apoyan el acuerdo de paz, porque obviamente uno dice, tiene que ser uno muy desalmado para no estar de acuerdo que se pare una guerra como la que se llevaba entre el gobierno colombiano y la guerrilla de las FARC, ¿sí? Eso tiene que estar uno pues un poquito mal de la cabeza incluso para no creer que esto fue muy bueno para el país, y no solo para el país, sino que esto fue muy bueno para la región. Esto yo creo que es algo que ya se ha venido entendiendo, incluso en algunos sectores que se oponían en su momento al acuerdo de paz, también han ido entendiendo de que esto fue lo mejor que le pudo pasar al país y que es lo que hay que seguir haciendo. Hay que seguir intentando hablar, hay que seguir intentando negociar para acabar definitivamente la guerra en nuestro país y poder convertirnos en un ejemplo de paz efectivo en la región y en el mundo. Ya como lo planteaban antes, este acuerdo de paz incluso a nosotros nos ha mostrado de que es algo que no existe en ningún lado. Nosotros a veces nos ponemos a pensar y es que no hay una cartilla, no existe un manual que diga cómo hacer un proceso de reincorporación. Nos va a tocar ponernos a la tarea en hacerlo, quizás cuando nosotros podamos llevar este barco a buen puerto, que yo estoy seguro que lo vamos a lograr. Ahora, como esa lectura de la que vengo hablando no se hizo bien, pues obviamente el partido llegó en un momento que cuando nosotros nos reunimos, incluso los consejeros políticos del partido hace poco, hacer un balance nacional del partido, y yo decía, para mí, lo mejor que le pasó al partido es lo que está pasando ahora, ¿sí? Que quienes de alguna manera no compartían la forma como el partido estaba llevando a cabo su estrategia política y no entendieron de alguna manera o no leyeron lo que se estaba planteando, incluso desde el nivel político, y es que esto ya no es una guerrilla donde se dice nosotros hacemos esto y es lo que vamos a hacer y es lo que se tiene que hacer, sino que ahora tenemos que acomodarnos a esa misma realidad. Y cuando digo, lo digo en el buen sentido de la palabra, y es que si hicimos la dejación de armas, nosotros nos...
He put on his mute.
algo que nosotros debemos tener en cuenta. Entonces, al seguir esas reglas del juego, debemos entender de que la democracia tiene que llevarse de la manera incluso más civilizada posible, ¿sí? Porque si no, entonces estamos equivocados. Y estar en una constante confrontación con el Estado colombiano, pues a nosotros no nos iba a llevar a nada, no nos llevó a nada en la guerra, pues tampoco nos iba a llevar a nada en la política. Entonces lo que había que hacer que era Colombia, el Estado colombiano y los gobiernos que han llegado, lo que han hecho es que han generado alianzas políticas para llegar allá. Una de las discusiones de la izquierda es esa, la izquierda pelea para llegar, pero no se pone de acuerdo para llegar, sino que se agarra antes de llegar. Yo creo que ese es uno de los problemas que tenemos nosotros. Ahora, lo que planteábamos nosotros es, hombre, aquí no vinimos nosotros a dedicarnos a un proceso de reincorporación durante los 15 años que está planteado el acuerdo, ¿sí? Digo, el proceso sobre todo de implementación, sino que nosotros vinimos aquí a...
Okay, I think we might have lost Mr. Semilla momentarily. But it was a good strategy of him to pretend to not
ir a
hear.
la reincorporación.
Yeah. All right. I think we're going to take this opportunity to maybe switch to the next question. Can you, Beth, maybe text him, tell him that we're losing him. I'm going to actually ask Ivan to jump in on a question that came from the audience, which is squarely on his area of expertise, which is the relationship between Colombia and Venezuela in relationship in particular with the dissidences, because Ricardo Suarez is asking, it seems that it would both benefit both countries to together confront the dissidences together, but the relations seem to be almost non-existent. And so what do you make of this? And Ivan, perhaps somebody else in the Q&A was asking about the killing of all these dissident leaderships right after the FTO was announced, in which they were listed. Do you think there's any coincidence to timing? Any speculation that you want to make on that topic?
I could speculate till the cows come home. Let's be absolutely clear. Relations between Venezuela and Colombia are non-existent at the moment. Diplomatic relations, intergovernmental relations, been the case since 2019, since the effort to, get humanitarian aid across the border in Cucuta. So how did this come about? And I think it's very significant if we to understand a little bit the origins of this total breakage in relations, and to see whether it's possible to restore ties and what that might mean in terms of dealing with the FARC dissidents. Because really the period which is crucial here is the first half of 2017. We've been talking about the demobilization process, the disarmament process. That was very focused in those first few months of 2017, but that happened to be exactly the same time that the political conflict was ratcheting up in Venezuela. The government there of Nicolas Maduro was turning against the National Assembly, stripping it of its powers, electing a new National Constituent Assembly, effectively wiping out the opposition as a significant political actor in that country, and obviously giving rise to huge protests and huge repression, the repression which is now being dealt with by the International Criminal Court. So these things were happening at the same time. And effectively the FARC, the bits of the FARC, those bits of the FARC which turned against the peace process, were to a degree caught in the middle. So what we had was, bit by bit, those FARC dissidents and the ELN, so the other major guerrilla in Colombia, both of which had long been present on the Venezuelan side of the border, this very long border share between Venezuela and Colombia, actually started to develop more stable relationships with the state, with security forces, with local authorities. They were able to move around more easily. They carried out certain political tasks along the border. In the south, the ELN and the FARC were involved in some of those mining activities, which you've seen recently. And there's ample evidence to prove this. At the same time, the right in Colombia, by which I mean the forces around Álvaro Uribe, saw that their big enemy of the last 2 decades, the FARC, was effectively handing over its arms, and they saw in its place a country which, as it were, took over the mantle of the left-wing bogeyman, Castrochavismo. That was the term which was devised to describe the ruling philosophy in Caracas. And so this generated both proximity between the state and those armed forces, the FARC and the ELN, and a growing polarization. And we saw that dramatically worsen from the moment that Iván Duque came to office in 2018. And soon after, of course, those relations were broken. But if we look at what's been happening most recently, we understand that rather than something which should give rise to greater differences between Venezuela and Colombia, something which should justify these accusations that one side and one capital is supporting, armed forces or has proxy armed forces on the border, sort of the typical tirades from the governments which we've been listening to from the last few years. What we actually see on the ground is that both governments have serious problems with FARC dissidents. FARC dissidents are disunited. They come in many factions. They're rivals to one another. They're competing with other armed groups, and relations with them from the state or the security forces are deeply unstable and volatile. We've seen what seemed to be, according to the Colombian government, direct attacks by one FARC faction against a military base and against the helicopter of President Duque a few months ago. And then we've seen an offensive by the Venezuelan armed forces against a different FARC faction in the state of Apure. And then most recently, this extremely strange series of killings of various senior figures from another FARC faction on the Venezuelan side of the border, the nature of which we really don't understand. I could speculate as to whether it's special forces, other FARC factions, other guerrilla factions, mercenaries. It would be impossible to say. But overall, the general conclusion you have to reach is that border area between Venezuela and Colombia, which is a site of tension between the two countries, where there are multiple armed forces competing for criminal revenues, where there's a humanitarian crisis underway with a huge flow of migrants from Venezuela leaving over the Colombian border, with all the problems which we've seen over that border during the pandemic, that border is the source of extreme instability. It is a constant risk because it's quite easy for any of those armed groups to act and claim or suggest it has the blessing and the protection of one of the states. And the states may not have actually given their blessing or protection. These armed groups seem to be acting relatively independently and autonomously, or at least they can't be fully trusted. So it's essential for Venezuela and Colombia to put aside some of their differences and to create a channel of communication. And unfortunately, that until now has not been possible. And I think it's going to be extremely important for the next Colombian government to make a serious effort in that respect, because this is a threat that may not actually escalate to real conflict, but it remains a constant danger. And that border is a serious hotbed of violence.
Thanks, Ivan. We have several questions on the delisting of the FARC, of the previous FARC from the FTO listing and the listing of the dissident groups. And so maybe we can ask Beth to address that. Essentially 2 questions. What was the reaction from the Colombian government to the delisting and the listing of the dissidences? And are you also welcoming of the news, these dissidents being included? Somebody's asking, should more splinter groups have listed? Is your assumption that state is going to be adding more factions, such as the ones listed by in the past, which they have estimated is around 90 armed groups active today?
Sure. So I think, the first point I want to make here is that it's clear to remember, it's important to remember that the Colombian government actually delisted the FARC several years ago. So from the Colombian government's perspective, it's already been acknowledged that because they entered into this very effective disarmament process and made that commitment to transition into political life, they are no longer a terrorist organization according to the Colombian state. And so in many ways, the US was sort of behind the curve with regard to that, making that change. I think one of the things that we hope that this change will facilitate is stronger economic integration, again, by facilitating access to the banking system, for example, cooperative projects from FARC, former FARC combatants who couldn't find bank accounts, couldn't find loans for credit. Facilitating their access to the system will be really important, I think, in the reincorporation process. In terms of the new listings of the dissidents, I think this is so new that I think we're also trying to make sense of what. I think the first question is really whether these designations reflect the reality of the FARC dissidents today. And here I would say that I think to a large extent, no, because essentially what we have is, as the question rightly points out, instead of a sort of monopolistic and hierarchical insurgency, as was the case with the previous FARC, today we have dozens of very fragmented groups that very much operate based on a local territorial logic that is often sort of, I want to control this one part of Nariño, or I want to control exactly this border exit in Putumayo headed to Ecuador. So the sort of coherence to the organizations is not the same that it used to be. And in the same way, although there are sort of now two buckets of alliances among the dissidents, one under the so-called Segunda Marca Italia and the other one under Gentil Duarte, Front 7 and 1. And these alliances are fluid, opportunistic, and we should not assume that they are fixed. They could change from one week to the next. And so having a broad bucket on the list like this does not necessarily mean that that will be a relevant designation, even in a span of weeks as the situation on the ground changes. I think we worry about the lack of specificity in the sanctions, not so much because we're not targeting all the bad people, but more actually because of the potentially negative fallout it could have for the demobilized FARC. Banks all around the world are sort of afraid of the great scepter of the US Treasury to come down upon them and punish them for working with listed parties. I think the fact that there's any FARC on the US terrorist list is a deterrent, unfortunately, for the private sector in Colombia and abroad to work with ex-combatants because of this stigmatization and the persistent overzealous implementation. So one thing that we hope happens with these new listings is, first of all, that they are highly specific, so that banks know exactly who they should not be working with and are able to work with everyone else. And secondly, that perhaps from the embassy or others would commit to sort of educating, let's say, the private sector about where they can operate and how they can play an effective role in the Colombian peace process. Because I think there is an appetite among many companies, Colombian companies, American companies, there's already European companies who are playing this role to sort of be on the ground and have that positive impact, but they have been inhibited by these rules. And so having clarity around the new rules is extremely important.
Thank you, Beth. And as we're getting close to the end of the event, maybe I'm going to wrap together a few of the other questions that we have, and we'll turn both to Mr. Aronson and to Beth for this last question, which is both one of what should be the priorities for the next government. I don't know if Ricardo is hearing me or not. I feel like this is all messy when you're online, but this is a good, it's good to remember that this is how the world happens. And Ricardo is somewhere in the middle of the TCR in Guaviare with little connection. This is how the peace implementation is going to. So it's a good reality check. The minister goes away and the signal doesn't work. And this is a little bit of a symbolic thing of what's happening. But it seems that he's gone. So maybe I might just turn to Bernie and Beth on that. What should be the priority for the next government in terms of implementation? And do you worry that if a president comes, which runs perhaps on an anti-peace process campaign, is there any chance that what we have gained will be lost? Is there any way that we will go backwards? Maybe I'll turn to Mr. Aronson first, as Beth has been speaking so much. I believe you're muted, sorry.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. I would hope that the new Colombian government, whichever coalition it represents, would speak very clearly and sincerely that they're understand that this is an agreement with the state, not a specific president, that it's the responsibility of the state to implement it, and that they're going to do so in good faith and re-legitimize the agreement and take it out of politics. That would be my hope. In terms of specifics in policy, if there's not security, none of the rest of the terms of the agreement are possible. And so I would go back to a structure that was actually created at the peace table between General Naranjo and Pablo Catatumbo. And they spent a lot of time on a subcommittee setting up a whole new structure for security in the country. And unfortunately, that has not been implemented anywhere near as extensively as called for. The reason I stress security is that rural development and transitional justice and all the other aspects, you know, crop substitution, if there's not security in these areas, they're not going to happen. So that has to be fundamental. I hope the government takes that responsibility seriously.
Thank you so much, Beth.
Yeah, so it's been interesting to watch the electoral debate so far. Because what we've seen actually up until now is that the peace accord simply isn't an electoral issue anymore. And in many ways, this is a positive development because we're no longer arguing about whether the accord should exist. We're living in a reality in which it exists and it's sort of state policy. And we're not trying to bicker about whether we change, you know, 3 parts of this one law that determines the transitional justice system. I mean, it's sort of a fixed, the institutionality of the accord in some levels has been achieved. And this is a marker of that. The flip side of that, I think, is that it is a little bit alarming how little debate there has been so far in the discussion about rural security and about how do you stabilize these areas that while the rest of the country has improved dramatically, there are certain areas of the country that have slipped backwards into a cycle of violence that is really very dramatic and in many ways even worse than what was experienced at the end of the conflict. We haven't heard from candidates yet, you know, this is my plan to stabilize Chocó or Catatumbo or Bajo Cauca. And I think that is missing very much. And if it isn't on the table, stands to exacerbate these longstanding inequalities between the rural and the urban debate. In terms of those priorities, you know, I think one of the opportunities the next government has, when the peace accord was signed, we had this remarkable moment of trust between you know, people who live in the countryside and the government. And that has been slowly slipping away, but I think it's possible to recover it with some sort of vision behind the implementation. I think what this government has done effectively is that they have sort of turned some of the points of the peace process into checklists of projects to implement, but they haven't articulated a vision for how that's going to transform life for people in rural areas. So they haven't seen a peace dividend. They haven't heard the story behind what's happening. And I think a new government could really recover that story of what it's going to look like, even if it takes a long time and it's arduous and it's tortuous. What does it look like for, you know, what is the vision for bringing rural areas, you know, recovering the long-term state debt of services and institutions and equality with those areas. So, you know, I think that is vital and key to that, agreed with Mr. Aronson, is security, but with a little bit of a different focus, I would say. I think, again, here we're sort of missing a vision. It's all about tactics at the moment. It's about the tactic and how many captures and how many hectares of coca, but that doesn't tell us about the fundamental well-being of the communities behind it. So I think when we need a strategy to reinvigorate rural transformation, and part of that includes a vision to provide integral territorial security that can finally sort of deliver that state presence that these areas have been long seeking.
Thank you so much, Beth. Before I turn to Ivan and Michael for any final remarks, I do feel like when we've been talking to people in Colombia and in the international community about the peace agreement, there's so much to be done. There's been so many problems with the implementation that sometimes we lose the big picture, which is that we ended the conflict with the biggest guerrilla group in the hemisphere, and one that had been, as a Colombian who grew up in the war, this is a significant difference. And the peace agreement seems to be resilient and it's there. And so I just want to end with a note of optimism that despite all of the challenges and the difficulties and how complicated my country is, we are in a such much better place. And yes, there's an increase in violence, and we must not put our guard down. But overall, this has been an incredible thing that for many of us who grew up in the war, we did not think we were gonna see this happen while we were alive. And so it is notable that so many of you, we've had over 100 people joining us today, that 5 years later, we still have this level of attention from people that follow this closely. So I'm hoping that this is just a good sign that things can be worked out eventually in some good way. So Michael, do you want to say something?
Well, since you've been optimistic, let me be pessimistic.
Oh.
We were commenting before the session about when I lived in Colombia and studied in Colombia in 1975, a few years ago. And back then, the topic was the rural-urban divide.
And here we are.
And here we are, how many years later, and it's the urban-rural divide. And then Beth's final comments that the risks of that getting worse in the years ahead just makes me a little bit, it's sobering to hear. And, I think that, Bernie Aronson put his finger on the challenge and said, it could be done, but there's a lack of political will. But that political will has been a longstanding challenge. And it's true that there is a peace process and a framework for that. But beyond that, everybody knows that this has been a problem in Colombia, leaving aside this, I think, historic peace process. And I agree with you when your optimistic recognition of the war is over, bringing the conflict to an end is, as Bernie said, no mean achievement. But I'm just reflecting on this. And this is going to be this divide, which risks getting worse and deeper, is going to be a real challenge. It affects the whole, the capacity of the country really to move on. And I wish I could be more confident that given the candidates, at least that I'm aware of, who may take over next August 7th, that they would be able to really, address this any better than their predecessors have. So just a final thought, but I don't want to detract from the optimism of this, that the war is over, and certainly something to celebrate, and it does make a big difference. And I think that's very important. I just want to thank the ICG for their partnership. Look forward to future events. Thanks to Ivan. Thanks, Renata, for your great moderation here and your very good questions. I want to thank Beth for participating and congratulate her, who is the author of the report. Thank you so much for an excellent report and for being here. To Mr. Semilla, who's come in and out of the conversation, muchas gracias. And we're sorry that we weren't able to have the participation of the government. It would have been very important, I think, to hear their perspective on these issues and to comment on this report and to have that kind of exchange and dialogue, which the dialogue always looks for in all of our events. But hopefully we'll look forward to other opportunities to engage government officials. And of course, to Bernie Aronson, as always, thank you so much for, and congratulations, salute your leadership was extremely important on this from the perspective of the United States government, which did play a very, very important role in this process. So a salute to Bernie for his great contributions, and thanking him for joining us. So thanks to everybody, and we hope to do this again. And for your next report, we hope you'll be able to. Hope you'll come to us, and we'll be able to work together.
Absolutely.
Very fun. I don't know if Yvonne wants to say.
Ivan, you want to say something before we go?
To say, I don't want to spoil those marvelous closing words from yourself, Michael and Renata, with my own. So I will leave it there and just to say thank you very much to all our viewers and to all our panelists. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a good night.
Gracias, Ricardo, por participar.